Hello everyone and welcome to episode 9 of the CEMS podcast. In this episode, I'll be talking to Rebekka Grun von Jok, who is the CEMS Senior Alumni of the Year 2019. She's going to talk about her own career and also share a lot of useful advice with you. So without further ado, let me welcome Rebekka Grun von Jok. Rebekka Grun von Jok, thank you so much for taking the time for the CEMS podcast.
Thank you.
Rebekka, could you briefly give a short introduction about yourself?
Yes, I'm an economist at the World Bank here in Washington, D.C. I work in the area of human development, which covers education, health, and social protection. So more precisely, I work on social protection, which is labor and social issues. And so I work with the ministries in charge of this area in developing countries. And right now, particularly in the Francophone West Africa, so in Burkina Faso and Cameroon, I work with ministries to reach the poorest in their country and to help them get jobs and get an income.
Okay, that is great. We'll talk about this in more detail a bit later, but right now we want to start at the very beginning. And since this is the CEMS podcast, I'm wondering, what was your CEMS journey like? How did you first find out about this and what universities did you study at?
Yes, I studied in St. Gallen. So when I started studying in St. Gallen in 1993, I saw they had this CEMS program, which included many interesting universities like the LSE, the HEC, Louvain-la-Neuve, ESADE, and I found that very interesting. And I thought, well, if I'm already here in St. Gallen, maybe I want to get as complete a package as possible. And I found this idea of having a double diploma or having a European diploma very tempting. So I applied for CEMS and I did my CEMS semester in Louvain-la-Neuve and the internship in Brussels. And I did my CEMS language examinations in French and Spanish.
Actually, it's quite a while since you did CEMS, so I'm not sure the next question applies to you equally like it is relevant for us. But these days we have a very active CEMS community life and every school has its CEMS club that organizes a lot of activities. Was that also the case for you back then? And if yes, were you active with the other CEMS students?
It wasn't as big an organization as it is now, and it wasn't as active. In St. Gallen, there were a few activities that came close. There was always a club for the exchange students. There was a club about those, which was also then interesting for those wanting to go abroad. There was a club for those interested in Latin American culture. So I was involved with those, but there wasn't a CEMS community per se. So congratulations on getting there now. I mean, it's very impressive what's going on now.
Thank you. And that's, of course, also thanks to the alumni contributions. I think everyone is pulling things together there, and it's really great to see what's getting built. But on to my next questions. With CEMS, usually we have a lot of people that have a business background, but actually you are an economist, as I have seen on your LinkedIn. Is that more of a plus side that you come in this program as an economist, or was it more difficult to find your access there?
No, it wasn't difficult. I was a little bit the odd one out in the CEMS program. I mean, in St. Gallen, it was easy because business and economics are close together there and everything was a little bit mixed and you do general studies together before. But it's not naturally the case in other universities. And also the CEMS community wasn't built so much with economics in mind, but with business. So I went with a list of CEMS universities to my economics professors in St. Gallen and said, okay, which ones of these should I choose? Which one of these is really good for economics? And they said, look, it's LSE and Louvain-la-Neuve are both really strong in economics. And then so I applied for Louvain-la-Neuve and got in. And I was very happy because in Louvain-la-Neuve, it was similar. In Louvain-la-Neuve as well, business and economics was quite close. They have a strong profile in statistics, in demography, in organizational psychology. So several issues that also in St. Gallen are treated in a way from across the disciplines. And so once I was in my exchange semester, I felt very much at home. And for the language, it's similar as you can benefit from the program as much as an economist as you can as a business student, I would think.
Okay, great. And after graduating from CEMS, you also did what most of the business students do. It's going to consulting. How was that? And could you tell us a bit more about that part of your life?
Yeah, I worked actually for 2 different consultancies, and they were very different. I mean, as you probably know, you have this big job fair in the IESEC Forum in St. Gallen every year. And so the firms come on campus and they interview you. And there was a company was coming and interviewing. And I really liked their perspectives. And I saw that they were advising governments the world over. So not just the private sector, but also governments. So I interviewed with them and I said, well, I find your profile really interesting, even if you do mostly corporate work in Europe. Let's try. So it worked out. So I joined for about 2 years. And what I really liked is company at the time had global staffing, meaning you have one staff pool, you can be staffed globally. So I worked in South Africa, I worked in Madrid, I worked in Munich, I worked in Paris. I didn't stick to one office, and I had also quite some control over where I was working. And I enjoyed that very much. I particularly enjoyed the time in Africa, in South Africa, in Johannesburg, and in Madrid. So that was great. Mm-hmm. When you have a corporate project in consulting, and it's, say, you're entering a new market or something, as you know, it can be extremely long work hours. So it was, I think, some times it was like from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. and then everybody goes for dinner at 11 p.m. I'm not sure that it's very productive. And it's one aspect I did not like very much. I mean, there are few of us who can do on 4 or 5 hours of sleep. Right. The majority of us cannot. And there's evidence that as you do your work tired, you become very conservative. You're losing innovation. So on the one hand, consulting has this great opportunity of developing your creativity and really influencing what you do and developing something new. But then there is this counterproductive tendency of working so long that the entire team becomes quite conservative and less innovative. So I saw that as a detriment, and I thought that in the long run, it's not the route I want to pursue. Also briefly wanted to mention the second consultancy I worked for. I worked for an economics consultancy in London, and they had very reasonable work hours from 9 to 6. And I found people incredibly productive. So in between those work hours, you work very hard and you're actually more productive than when you sit there until 10 p.m. So I enjoyed that bit very much. They worked for the British government, and they still do. And they work for several blue chip companies in the private sector. And so I changed to the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit in London, which is, it doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately, but it was founded under Tony Blair, I think, and it was a bit like the strategy unit, like a strategy consultancy annexed to the Prime Minister's office. So we weren't sitting in Downing Street, but we were sitting in Admiralty Arch, right next to it, if you want. And the day-to-day firefighting was done in Downing Street, and we did the longer-term project, 6 to 9 month strategy projects that was feeding into the firefighting of Downing Street. So our clients were the advisors of Downing Street. That was actually very interesting. Again, yes, the workouts were not short, but reasonable. You pull the occasional all-nighter because you have emergencies as well in the public sector. And I found it intellectually very stimulating. And it was also stimulating to see how quickly your advice and your work can actually be translated into something that benefits people.
To be a bit more concrete, was that also economics work, or what kind of work did you do there?
Yes, it was very relevant for economics. It was about improving public services. It was about the early years services. It was about building a professional training system, or linking different elements of the skills training and further education system in Britain, so it would become more attractive to a bigger group of people and get a bigger group of people above a higher level of education. And so it was about shaping public services, designing public services, and an economist's lens was very much useful, I would think.
Okay, very nice. And that already slightly shows where you're heading afterwards, and that is the World Bank. How did that transition happen?
Well, it had been my goal for a long time to join an international organization and also to work in development. The consultancy I worked with at the time also had an international team and did some international work, but it was it was a bit more limited in scope. And I knew that at the World Bank, that kind of work I wanted to do wasn't really limited, but would be across the globe. So I applied to the Young Professionals program and went through the different stages. And got accepted. And that was in 2005. So it's a little while ago now.
Oh, great. And then you went through the whole organization. But maybe first of all, most of our listeners will actually not be aware with the detailed workings of such an organization that is not working for profit or anything. So is it very bureaucratic, or does it feel like any other large company? How would you describe it?
Some aspects are like in a multinational. Some aspects are more bureaucratic. The organization as such is much more accountable to the public than would be a private company. So there's a lot more transparency. Virtually everything we do is public. All major documents are published in full. So it's, which would definitely not happen in consulting. I mean, it's incredibly confidential. We have some aspects, of course, where there's client confidentiality, but I would say the vast majority of items we work on is public. So the accountability is strong. And with that comes some bureaucracy. And of course, an organization that's grown over time develops its own rules and bureaucracy. So that's true. But it's also, I would think, it's more democratic and equitable than your typical multinational. The managers and directors can't just take decisions without consulting like that, like they could probably in the private sector. And so in that way, it's closer to the civil service where you need to watch the checks and balances. So there's a lot of consulting, there are checks and balances, there's transparency. And you see sometimes, I mean, and I saw that in some of our client countries when, say, there's a government transition, and sometimes people who've proven themselves in the private sector and were very successful transition into the civil service or become a politician, become a minister. Sometimes they forget this aspect. They forget this consultation, how important that is. And they forget that they're even more stuck in this principal-agent framework, that they have to, the agencies that are attached to their ministry don't need to obey them in a way. They need to be convinced. And sometimes you see new ministers coming from a private sector, that come full of ideas and very motivated. But this is an aspect that's a bit new, and you find that in the bank as well. The agents are powerful. You need to consult people, and you need to convince them.
I can imagine. And the accountability you described, that's towards the countries that pay most of the money, or towards whom are you accountable?
Well, to the general public, so to the global public, to the media, to NGOs. I mean, NGOs take a lot of interest in our work and are interested and have, causes dear to their heart and advocate. And so they definitely demand and receive accountability. And of course, our client countries, first and foremost, I mean, the governments we work for. They can demand accounts. Okay,
speaking about client countries, the area you work on is called human development, right? And what exactly is that area? How do you measure success in that area? Could you describe a little bit?
Yes, so human development is education, health, and social protection. So in particular, I work on social protection. So how do I measure success on the projects? Say a project would be typically in West Africa now like a social assistance project, so where a government finds the poorest within their country and pays them a small cash transfer every couple of months for 2 or 3 years, and accompanied by measures and training programs to improve the productivity of people, get them into work, or improve their small businesses if they have one. So what is success? Success there is, well, there's some outputs and some outcomes. The outputs is how many people do I reach? So out of the poor in the country, from the household service, I know how many people are poor. I want to reach as many of them as possible. And then when I reach them and they receive the program, I want them to exit poverty. And that we measure that with consumption. So when their consumption level, so the expenditure for food and clothing and other things, when that is high enough to be above the poverty line, then they are out. And we measure that. We measure that after our projects, and we see how many people then successfully transition out of poverty.
Okay, and there is a saying that if there is a starving person, you shouldn't give him a fish, but you should teach him how to fish. I assume that's also your approach there, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. So the key is the accompanying measures there. So people need the cash. I mean, what is the cash transfer? The cash transfer is basically a poverty insurance. So you become eligible when you fall into poverty. It's important because if not, it's really day-to-day stress, and it's very hard to even plan for the education of your kids. So you need to have some minimum insurance against this stress. So to allow people to plan and to take some minimal risk with their small business or with education. And so once that's taken care of, then you can show people, okay, here's the nearest health center. That's what you can get from the health center. Here's the school. Please send all your kids to school. And the beneficiaries in my client countries, the beneficiaries sign what we call a moral contract, it's explained in pictures and explained in writing in various languages, where they commit themselves and say, I will send my children to school. I will feed pregnant women and the elderly 3 meals a day. I will send these sick people to the health center. I will participate in the courses about good education and good nutrition, etc. So, and they do. So they commit themselves. And we see from our impact evaluations that these programs work. We see that people start by eating better, so they really meet the very first necessities first. They start by eating better, then the kids go to school, they get their school books, the sick people go to the doctor, and in the longer run, people even manage to save a little, and they invest it in their small businesses, in their household assets. They buy themselves, say, a cart with a donkey, and they go to the nearest market, and they sell their veggies a bit more expensively, and things like that.
That must be really wonderful to observe when the people can develop with your help, right?
It is, yes. It's very rewarding. Yes.
And is that typically what the governments also are asking from you, or is it more that they are trying to get a lot of money in the country no matter what? How are they typically cooperating with you?
Well, it depends on where we are in the project cycle. So say, what is a big topic right now is, of course, climate change and the drought that can come with it, and also floodings. And it's an additional shock to countries that are already poor. And then they come to us and say, you know, what can we do against this? We have some regions that were already improving, and we have risk that they fall into food insecurity, and we have there are other things exacerbating that. So there's a climate change, there's a food insecurity, but sometimes you have internal displacement or forced displacement. There are refugees, there's a conflicting areas surrounding a country and driving large groups of people to the inland, and that can cause food insecurity as well. So these issues are then brought to us and sometimes already on the brink of catastrophe, if you want. And then we have to act very quickly and work together with humanitarian partners, and also figure out in-house would we design now an operation that takes care of these things. And in my particular sector, one thing we do is what we call adaptive social protection, whereby we measure very carefully the risk of food insecurity in different areas, and we work with the system the country has in place, but we also try to improve it technically to measure this food insecurity and to be able to pay a bit more quickly and a bit more short term, not only based on poverty, but also on the climate shocks, on the food insecurity shocks. Another thing we do is, and this is what comes. So basically they come with the problem. What we do is we help design an operation and then help implement it.
Maybe the last question to this topic. Some people might think when you're solving these problems for the governments, then they get complacent and think that there's always international organizations coming to help and they don't need to do anything. Did you ever encounter this type of problem, or what do you think about it?
I think the way we work hedges against that relatively well, because we don't implement directly. We give a credit or a grant to the government, and then it's a government team implementing. So we help design the program, and we supervise the government management team. We call that a project implementation unit. We supervise them in the implementation because it's World Bank money that they're using. But they do it. So they do the job.
Yeah, that sounds really nice. Do you have anything left that you would like to mention about the World bank or your area of work?
Well, just to encourage you to read all that's out there, I realize that in Europe sometimes the World Bank is not that much on people's radar. It's maybe a bit more on people's radar in the Americas, but there's a lot. I mean, do read up on what we do and do hold us accountable. I mean, that's what we are there for. So if you as citizens, your tax money goes towards funding us. So if you have particular concerns that are close to your heart, I mean, influence your governments, who are our governors, and also hold us accountable to work on the global issues that you see.
Okay, that's some great advice. I think that's definitely worth doing for our listeners. And now we change to some more personal topics. And the first one would be that you have been writing some blog posts on the Huffington Post and also a lot actually of tweets recently and in the past years. Is that your personal motivation, or do you have any goals with this? How did it come about?
Well, the Huffington Post blog, so my blog is more like a personal hobby. So I do that in my spare time, and sort of, for years and years I've researched a bit the economics of dating and relationships. But the economic research in that area is actually quite related to the economics of labor markets. So there are some synergies with my work. But that's a personal thing, and it's in a way a hobby that came out of an interest. And interestingly, there is an audience out there. There are people who need to hear those messages and who like it, and it's very nice to engage in that area.
Yeah, I think they are very interesting topics, and actually, even though some of the articles are a bit older, they're still very relevant. And I also encourage every one of our listeners to check them out. I'll definitely include a link into the show notes. And considering that you're giving some advice in this blog post and on Twitter and everywhere, do you have some life or any kind of advice that you could give to our listeners to have a good, productive, and happy life?
Yeah, I recently gave a TEDx talk on this, on my blog topic in Zurich, actually, in TEDx Zurich. And sort of my key message was, you cannot control the result, but you can definitely set the odds in your favor. So even when it comes then to choosing how to form a family, how to find a partner, how to live your family life, there's a lot of evidence out there that is really useful, and there's no shame in being strategic about this. There's no shame in exploring how to make the best choices in that area. And I want to encourage people to do that and to take confidence and take power over that aspect of their lives as well.
Okay, that's some great advice, and I'm sure if we check out the TED Talk, then we'll learn even more about this. Lastly, is there anything else you would like to share with the CEMS wide world?
Yes. I mean, as I said in the beginning, I find it really impressive how the CEMS community has grown and how active you are. So there's so much potential in there. And I want to tell you a small anecdote, and also that is in a way my message of something I think CEMS could really help with. The coordinator, so the head of the government management team that manages the social assistance project in Cameroon, the coordinator, he studied in Louvain-la-Neuve as well. He had a scholarship and he did demography. So he's a bit older than me, Cameroonian gentleman, and he studied in Louvain-la-Neuve. So when we first met, we didn't have much in common, but we had this memory in common. We knew Louvain-la-Neuve. We could exchange notes and talk about it. And so that was so enriching. And I feel that CEMS should really reach out to developing countries and see how students from developing countries could also get into the network and get into the CEMS schools. I mean, of course, especially Africa is close to my heart. And I see that St. Gallen, for example, has recently founded a center which is about research on Africa. And I think they even did it jointly with the university in Yaoundé in Cameroon. So these kind of initiatives, if that could be carried into the CEMS community, I think that would be enriching for everyone.
Great. And I think that's definitely also focus of CEMS, since two of the most recent joining universities are the American University of Cairo and one other university in Cape Town. So very good. And I'm sure CEMS will develop in that direction. And I want to congratulate you once more for becoming the CEMS Alumni of the Year in the senior category. And where could people learn more about you if they're interested in what you're doing and your work?
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I was really humbled and touched by that prize. I tweet about my work a lot. So I'm on LinkedIn and I'm on Twitter, and my professional work, I mostly share updates via LinkedIn and Twitter. So if there's any major publication or any major project that has started or is concluded, I usually tweet about it. And I also put an update on my LinkedIn profile. So I think on the professional activity, those would be the best sources to engage with what I do. And then also link to our webpage where relevant.
Of course, that will all be included in the show notes. And with that, thank you very much for your time, Rebekka Grun von Jog.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
All right, and with that, we already arrived at the end of this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. As always, don't forget to rate us, review us, and share what you've learned with your fellow CEMSies. The next episode will already be the last of our season 1, and after that, we'll slightly change the format. You'll hear more about that in our next episode. And until then, I wish you all a sensational time.